Well, I'll get to the Antichrist in a second.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to BungaCast. Happy Halloween for those who observe the sacred rituals of the day. And we're all here in wearing face paint as we record, which you'd have no way of verifying that, of course, because this is a podcast and we have no video.
We're dressing up as podcasters from Brooklyn or Sao Paulo or London, like the truly scary, like people you don't want to meet on the street or get into a conversation with. So
they'll talk at you, but you just sit quiet and listen.
Yeah,
Yes.
and they never actually ask trick or treat. You just have to give them a treat for them to leave.
Very good. I'm Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo, Brazil. That voice you've just heard there before is George Hoare in London. And we're joined once again, actually for the first time in a rather long time, Geoff Shullenberger, managing editor at Compact Magazine. Hi, Geoff.
How's it going, guys?
Rather well. We're recording this on a Friday evening, so I will get into my makeup after this. But
I'm about to go see a Finnish horror movie
oh yeah,
for my part of my Halloween festivities, which is called The White Reindeer and evidently involves an evil, murderous reindeer. So seems appropriate to the Finns. It's some sort of Finnish folk horror from the 60s. So
oh wow,
I'm excited about it.
And that's showing it like at a cinema.
Yeah, it's sort of art house cinema that does lots of retrospective. So they're actually kicking off a folk horror, an international folk horror series. So
sounds
there are many countries represented.
Sounds literally fascist.
Recently rewatched The Killing of a Sacred Deer, which is maybe a folk horror, maybe not, and has a definite deer connection. So if you're looking for a double bill, I would recommend that. So it's dear to me. That film.
I saw that when it came out, and I would like to see it again. I just saw Bugonia, which I do recommend. It's kind of along with Eddington. It feels like parts of it were just sort of extracted from my brain and projected on screen. So quite a disturbing experience in that way.
I haven't seen either, so I have to wait to discover what's actually in your brain. But maybe I can just ask you some questions today and advance a little bit further in that project. So we're going to be talking here today about, mainly about the right, about the US right, about the tech right, and tensions indeed within it, things that often get glossed over in discussions of the right today. So we're going to start off with censorship, move on to tech, and maybe a bit on Millet if we get a chance towards the end of it. So firstly, I mean, I've liked a lot of your posts recently and some of your writing as well with regard to kind of the radical right's contradictions, especially as it's in power in a lot of places. And one of the things that it's actually kind of amused me is that people have talked about, or let me give this some other context. We started off the year talking about J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, where he made a kind of pretty decent defense of democracy and of free speech, which I don't want to say we heralded it, but we said, it's good that someone's saying this, even if it's hypocritical or will be undermined by future actions. And so it has been. People have now been trying to throw back the cancel culture accusation that was thrown at the left, at the right, and calling it right-wing cancel culture. And this seems to me a little bit of things coming a full circle, which is to say, or maybe a half circle, I'm not really sure the metaphor, but it's basically like cancel culture was a term that was invented to depict left-wing censorship carried out often by cultural institutions or by mobs online. That is to say, it wasn't carried out by any authority, really. It was much more of an informal form of censorship, cancellation, etc. consequences and accountability, as its advocates would say in defense of it. And now people are saying, well, the censorship is right-wing cancel culture, and it's a little bit bizarre, because it's like, well, this is just censorship. We don't need to find kind of invent new terms to depict it. I don't know. What do you think, as you observe this kind of stuff, especially in the US, much more closely than I do?
Part of me wants to say maybe the term is just sort of outliving its usefulness, and it's been used to kind of group together a whole range of phenomena that, in fact, maybe shouldn't be considered the same thing. And it's also, it just seems to me there are a number of kind of myths and notions about it that have built up that aren't really accurate as to how these sort of culture war battles have played out. So part of me wants to take the long view and say there is kind of a discrete phenomenon you can trace back to the early period of the internet, where particularly this kind of mobbing dynamic of, large numbers of people identifying, the main character of the day, or the person who, has violated some kind of taboo and is therefore going to be kind of dragged out and made a lesson of. And it's interesting to me that in the very first moment when you saw this occurring, it was kind of politically inchoate, I would say. It wasn't, it had a left-wing slant maybe, or a progressive slant, but it wasn't uniformly progressive, and it often involved things that weren't all that politically legible. One place we can go back to is this book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, by, I believe, Welsh journalist John Ronson, who he talks about, if you go back to the book, I've revisited a couple times, at least skimming, and he talks about his own participation in this and how it felt, when the possibility of doing this first emerged, it felt exciting. People felt kind of thrilled by being able to. I mean, here's an example that comes to mind that I remember from the early years of this was, I don't know if either of you, maybe this is just a very American thing, but there was this, he was a suburban dentist somewhere, I believe, in, I don't know, Michigan or something, who went on one of these hunting safaris in Africa and killed several big game. And then he, posed with pictures of them. And so this was an example of where there was just this kind of spontaneous outpouring of outrage, and this, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people joined in, and they started calling his, I think they started like spamming his website or the review sites for his dentistry practice with negative reviews. And I don't know, I mean, I think he was self-employed, so they couldn't get him fired, but they tried in various ways to bring down consequences on him. And so the point is, like, I suppose you could say this was some sort of, woke animal rights sensibility at work here, but it really wasn't particularly politically coded overall. And an interesting thing that I often think about is that Justine Sacco, who was one of these main characters of the day back in, I believe, 2013 or 2014, she makes this joke about going to Africa saying, "I hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white." And so she then gets on a plane, and it's this whole kind of drama unfolds because she's on the plane and doesn't have internet, and the whole world is talking about her. And so by the time she lands, her whole life is, so it's sort of this incredible, I mean, I'm surprised they haven't made a movie of it, or maybe it would just be too boring because she'd be sitting on the plane, not knowing anything of what was going on. But there is something about the temporality and chronology of that that's really fascinating.
A series, you could at least do like a series out of it, where you do 1 hour long episodes or 40-minute episodes, right? That would work. And then like the cancellation series, right? And you deal with like the history of a different cancellation each time.
I think Christopher Nolan could do it. There'd be some kind of weird kind of time, all these different timelines, and then it all goes down to the moment where she presses send tweet, because that was a fairly iconic, like, somebody making a joke, in bad taste or not, and then just thinking, everything's fine, and then you wake up or get off the plane at the other end. No, your life is now ruined. You are well, we're talking about her, but I guess this isn't really probably the context in which she would have liked to have been talked about. And that was I guess that kind of reinforces the need to always be be by your phone and to kind of, to respond to the potential cancellation. Because if you snooze, you lose, and then you wake up in a different country with your reputation in tatters.
Yeah. And so the amazing thing about that episode is that, again, it would seem like this was kind of left coded, but even in that case, none other than Donald Trump, joined in the cancellation. He posted something, he like retweeted her tweet and said, Justine, you're fired, or something like that. This was still in the tail end of his apprentice days. So, in other words, it wasn't something people, it reflected kind of vaguely liberal mores of the public culture, but it wasn't really seen as a weapon of progressive dominance in these early periods. And in fact, there were notable cases that didn't, that reflected not necessarily very left-coded values. There was another case discussed by Ronson in which this woman and her friend took a selfie in which they were like misbehaving in some way at Arlington National Cemetery around all the military graves. And she was also, fired from her job and made main character of the day for a bit. And obviously that's, more of a kind of disrespecting the military and violating American patriotism in that way. So the point is, this early period, it's kind of politically inchoate. Then it seems that it takes shape in a more aggressively progressive direction, and that seems to be, I mean, I don't know, it's a little bit hard to define kind of where this begins, because obviously there were these kind of cultural phenomena particularly in left-wing spaces were notorious for these sorts of dynamics before this. So what I think is distinctive here is the kind of mass element of it and the sort of decentralized and sort of crowdsourced aspect of it. I mean, that seems to be what's distinctive in the current era. And the fact that it's made visible to the public, it becomes a public spectacle. Obviously, you had all these kind of dynamics in various ways and in different cultures to different extents, in different localized environments. But, the basic feature is some kind of context collapse, and the result being that it can kind of galvanize and mobilize immense numbers of people ephemerally across the globe, even outside of any particular context. And often that's important to what happens, because somebody says something that might, in context, be, if not inoffensive, at least sort of understood in a certain way. But once it's ripped out of context, it can be interpreted in all manner of ways and can be interpreted quite uncharitably. So it seems that's sort of what's distinctive about this phenomenon. It begins in this kind of inchoate way, and then in the late 2010s, it takes on this progressive flavor. I tend to think the right particularly when talking about what they are doing right now, or the kind of efforts that they're supporting, they sort of mischaracterize what this was all about. For the most part, it was about purging progressive institutions or progressive dominated institutions of people who didn't hew certain party lines, who didn't, adopt new orthodoxies quickly enough. And so it tended to be a sort of ideologically internal, cancellation in which progressives attempted to impose an orthodoxy within relatively localized spaces. Now they could mobilize the resources of this kind of crowdsourced outrage to do that, and often did. But nonetheless, that's sort of the main type of effect that it tended to have. The thing that seems distinctive to me about this wave of right-wing cancellation, not distinctive in an absolute sense, but it's directionally somewhat different, that we've seen this year is, and the first case of this that I observed and sort of commented on that had this characteristic was after the attempted assassination of Trump, that there were, I believe, spearheaded by libs of TikTok, there were, like what happened more recently with Charlie Kirk, there were efforts to identify people who had made jokes about the assassination, or who had said, oh, goddamn, he missed, or, if only he had better aim, and things like that. And so that seemed to be a little bit different, only insofar as it wasn't trying to purge. I mean, often they will say, like, if you're a teacher or something like that, you shouldn't. Somebody who says this kind of thing shouldn't be imparting values to our children. But in fact, they often went after pretty random people, like Walmart clerks and people like that. And so this, not people who have any kind of public facing role or any kind of role in which their worldview or ideology matters at all. Like they're just, kind of grunts in some sort of service job. And
do you think that's meaningful, like in any way? Like
what that they chose to target these people?
That they went after random people. I mean, the left-wing versions of it, the progressive version of it, in which people were purged, and often it was people who had some association to liberal or progressive institutions or forms of thought, but some sort of allegiance to, right? They're identifiably kind of liberals or leftists, often the people who were objects of cancellation. And I don't want to say that they were all people who held some position of influence or power, but I think mainly they were. And then I wonder whether these examples of what would still fit under the umbrella of cancel culture, of cancellation, right, rather than just outright censorship, the targeting of kind of random people, if you think that's meaningful, or if that's just kind of happenstance.
Yeah, it's something I've been trying to figure out. It does seem to be an attempt to impose a set of what's interesting is that despite the scale of left-wing cancel culture was sort of ultimately quite local in its strongest effects, that there was sort of a sense that they could only control their own institutions. And so even when they went after figures on the right like Milo Yiannopoulos, it was to prevent them from being platformed by or from having from being admitted into or allowed to gain any kind of affiliation or association with like institutions they considered theirs. And so it seems that something slightly different is going on here, which is that there's a desire to, I mean, obviously part of it is just all these things are driven by a kind of primal rage on one level. and that's so it's not always that strategic, but at the same time, the logic of it seems to be that, and this is sort of an interesting point, I would say, because it points to an interesting rift within the right at the moment, which is that the right has, for a long time, but especially so in the past decade, has defined itself through its kind of insolence and bravado and, happiness to sort of slay sacred cows and be the ones who don't care about taboos. And you even see this in the behavior of sort of our most online politician, other than Trump himself, which is J.D. Vance, who's very online in a specific way, which is that his kind of style is very aligned with the sort of younger online right. And, you notice that he curses and kind of makes crude jokes and things like this. So it's kind of this contempt for the sort of gravitas of any kind of public culture. And so what I think is sort of interesting here is that, the ideas, and you'll see them when they sort of try to justify, like, oh, we called this poor schlub who works at Burger King, we, called the regional Burger King office and got him fired. They'll sort of say, well, it's just indecent for somebody who celebrates murder to be, employed at all or serving customers. And it's like, okay, so there's some kind of moral mission here, so ostensibly, where you think that there should be some kind of shared set of standards about what sort of public speech is acceptable and what's beyond the pale. So, but what's interesting is that is sort of at odds with this extremely
it's
vulgar...
a totally different posture. Yeah, it's like, you can literally characterize it by posture. One is upstanding, and has spine and is all about holding things together, and the other is kind of getting your shoulder in and trying to provoke, trying to niggle, try to transgress a boundary, right? You're stepping over. There's like a kind of, it's quite easy to depict like corporally the different things that are going on.
Yeah, and it just strikes me that in some ways we could, trace this all back to the New Left in the 60s and this kind of great divergence in American culture between this traditional kind of respect for national symbols and for some kind of standards of decency in public culture, and then the new left embracing this crude and vulgar public style, and presenting that as an avenue of liberation. And so what's interesting is it seems like now you have in both ends of the political spectrum this kind of schizoid position where you have both a certain posturing that resembles that kind of new left stance, and the other thing that I've been reading a lot about lately and writing about some is, and I remember you did an episode on the Californian ideology, and I think it is important also to note that the internet in its origins is infused with this new left sensibility, because the people who created it were essentially direct descendants of the Californian counterculture. And they really saw the internet as a space to a new opportunity to realize those ideals of kind of maximal freedom of expression, and of being able to kind of throw off the stifling kind of rules and norms that govern kind of boring normie middle class life. And so it's interesting to me that the two, and so I think cancel culture is itself a sort of weird phenomenon in this regard, we could say more broadly, because it's always about some kind of norm, some kind of project of norm enforcement, even if that's poorly articulated or understood by the people doing it. But at the same time, it often takes this form of vulgarity and of just indecency and gratuitous kind of gleeful cruelty and sadism. So it really seems like we're still just in this kind of mess that's been created by the collision of these sort of new left cultural values with this ongoing collision of those with whatever remain or whatever attempts there are to kind of salvage some kind of version of mores or norms that would govern a public culture. And so that, I think, that's kind of abstract, but I sort of see the three stages of it as different manifestations of that broader kind of cultural conflict, which both sides are sort of internally riven by.
Yeah, I sort of I see something like that that intuitively seems correct in your kind of those three stages, the kind of the random pylons, the main characters getting sacrificed, the witch finders maybe doing this for clout, and then that second phase, which seemed very like bitter and maybe I felt myself to be more at risk when it was the PMC with their internal cancellations and their kind of we need to find a way to play out this intense competition and at the same time impose our ideological coherence, so any enemies that I have who step out of line or don't adopt doctrine quickly enough can be thrown to the wolves. But now, yeah, it seems almost like it's a return more to that first phase now, where it is a bit more and anyone, it's not just the kind of internal coherence of the PMC that is being enforced. It is a broader set of norms, and perhaps, and so that means it's, well, maybe I'm kind of contradicting myself. Maybe we're all at risk because these norms don't seem to me to be very clearly articulated or very consistent. Because at the same time, you have a kind of respect for for politics and don't make jokes about political violence, but then you have, I don't know if you guys saw this, the American president making an AI video about flying over some No Kings protesters and dropping massive amounts of shit on them. And it's like, so which one of these norms is the right one? Is it kind of, you can say anything as long as you have, a kind of wink and, say it with humor, or are we trying to return to some kind of elevated discourse? And so anybody who jokes about political violence, however, potentially like bad taste those jokes are, it deserves to be fired from their job, which has nothing to do with political violence. Anyway, I don't know if there was a question there, but just hearing you talk through it, it made me think two things. One, because you often hear like, oh, censorship doesn't work. right? So you can't censor the truth. All you can do is you can make me more committed to this kind of idea of truth that I have, and or this kind of conscience that steers me towards this belief. But it seems like that isn't actually true. Like censorship has, or cancel culture, or control of speech, or reinforcing through kind of social avenues a certain set of ideas, that has become part of what passes for contemporary politics. And it probably does seem ultimately the origin is in that kind of techno-populist kind of thesis, the idea that, you know, once you have a desubstantialized politics, everything is about everything. It makes sense that you don't have a kind of, here are these interests against here are these interests. Instead it's much more, instead of two great like armies, this analogy might not work, two great armies on the battlefield kind of opposing each other in fairly set positions, it's like any individual person is a combatant and can be rightly kind of gunned down if they're in the wrong position or they put their head up above the parapet. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I should have twisted that into a question at the end, but I guess my
I thought
my
that was.
thought
I think
just,
that's a good point. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I don't want to make points. We have a
Let me
guest.
just
I
let
want
me
to be
just
friendly and ask questions, and rather than just saying, "Here's what I think." That's not how you have conversations, Alex. You generally tend to just like ask other people things, and in my experience at least, rather than just, you know, making declarative statements. That would be quite a
I mean,
strange
yeah, if you're a
conversation.
woman, you ask questions and you ask about things, and otherwise,
If you're a human being,
you just shout at people. No, you know, this has become a meme, but you know, female friends and my wife have taken it up. You know, we come back from the pub and it's like, so what's going on with such and such? I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, what do you mean you didn't ask? Like, well, I don't know. We were just talking. You know, we weren't asking each other questions.
Yeah, I have the same conversation regularly.
Where's the goss? I'm like, goss? No, I think gossip is disreputable. I don't think one should gossip ever. Anyway, that aside, yeah, no, I don't know if Geoff, you want to add it into that. I mean, the only thing I was going to say about it is that one, like in response to George, you could either understand it as just being, well, it's universal hypocrisy, right? That everyone sets up these ad hoc norms and mores as a way to attack the enemy, which are promptly undermined. And so, you know, it's universal hypocrisy. It's everything kind of falls down ultimately on Schmittian enmity, or as I called it, like Disney Schmittianism, you know, which is a bit like Funhouse Schmittianism, because it's kind of nothing ever really matters. I mean, certainly in like at the level of discourse. The other interpretation, which
sorry, can I just interrupt you there? Disney Schmittianism. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before. Listen, this should have more play, this concept. I just feel like, you know, listeners should go and use it in the next conversation that they have with their male friends at the pub, where they don't ask each other any questions. They just discourse, because it's I think it's true. It is true. People like to play that. There's a certain frisson in like, oh yeah, they're the enemy, but it's also kind of infantilized as well. So I just wanted to say I think it's a good phrase. Why aren't people on the street just like talking about it? Why aren't there t-shirts with it on?
We should make t-shirts. My other interpretation is just that we're maybe perhaps in a transitional moment, because we discussed on a podcast a couple of months back about whether the long 1960s is over. And I'm increasingly of this view, and just to rehearse the points really briefly. One, it's that you have the actual generation of the 60s of baby boomers sunsetting. Secondly, that the transgressive stance associated with the left has been adopted by the right, and it's kind of been universalized. And that, I think, maybe makes it lose its punchiness, but also that the right, it's at the same time, is kind of adopting, you know, kind of a civilizational nationalism or something like that, you know, kind of defending Christian civilization and so on. And that sits uneasily, of course, with being a troll. Thirdly, the kind of a lot of the precepts of the new left and its successors have been defeated. If we're talking about kind of rainbow coalition left populism, not least because a lot of the kind of right-wing populists have been able to cobble together similar sort of coalitions, particularly in the US. And there's some other points, and I think, you know, the kind of new spirit of capitalism, of flexibility, autonomy, self-expression, it's also kind of already has been replaced by something else, by something harder and more frightening, and which doesn't really propose any kind of sunny vision. And you know, you could almost go further and say, like, you know, we were never postmodern. To that's another silly but we were never postmodern, or we were only very briefly postmodern, because that complete antinomianism, the focus on the marginality, on flexibility, whether it's in the arts and culture or in politics, like that was a brief moment perhaps in the 90s, and things kind of solidified again pretty quickly afterwards. And so no one was ever really a genuine postmodernist, and perhaps it's impossible. And so maybe for the same reason, no one can be a permanent troll, because you end up, wanting to stand up straight and castigate other people for their behavior, as the right is now doing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I wrote something about this. This is maybe veering too far away from the topic, but it's interesting. There was this attempt to theorize what came after postmodernism that was called metamodernism, which I don't know if you've come across this. It has a sort of bizarre history, like terminological history, and it's associated with some very odd characters, including very odd characters. So to name two of them, two people notable for theorizing metamodernism: one, Luke Turner, the wealthy art, member of this art collective with Shia LaBeouf, who was involved in various strange culture war incidents, which I won't go further into. And even more strangely, Seth Abramson, a Bernie bro turned Russiagate conspiracy theorist who is also, or was, a professor of creative writing. And he had also theorized metamodernism. So it was sort of this, I think it's relevant to what you're just saying, Alex, because it was sort of this attempt to imagine how you could have the sort of playful provisionality of the postmodern combined with some sort of moral seriousness. And in some ways, I wrote a post about this a few years ago where I focused on this this Luke Turner, co-created art project, He Will Not Divide Us, which became this whole strange saga involving alt-right trolls sort of trying to prevent this work from being displayed. I don't know if you're familiar with this whole saga, but it's kind of fascinating. No. It was the first attempt at sort of Trump era resistance art, I would say. And it has a whole fascinating story, which people should check out. There's a documentary about it as well, which I don't recall the name of. But in any case, I think it's an interesting concept for trying to think about the late 2010s liberal left. And I wrote a blog post about this a number of years ago. And I believe it was called The Meta-Modern Turn and Trump Era Culture or something like that. And in any case, it's interesting because it sort of tries to imagine what comes after postmodernism, and it, in a way, theorizes but also sort of advocates some of the excesses of left moralism and this kind of weird combination of a sort of playful postmodern sensibility with a sort of deep moral seriousness. And it tries to present this in programmatic positive terms, but of course, it becomes this kind of totally dreadful project in practice. But I think it is useful because it sort of captures something about, where the postmodern project founders, I think often people think of this as maybe the transit. You've talked a lot about generations, the transition from, sort of Gen X irony to millennial sincerity or something like that. But I don't know. It's an interesting thing. But now that we're having this conversation, I'm sort of thinking about. I've seen a few people talking about the postmodern right recently, but maybe I need to write something on the meta-modern right.
Right.
Sort of,
yeah.
How can you be a troll and also the moral majority at the same time? That's sort of that's in a way the JD Vance project. Yeah. So right. maybe the real meta-modernist now is JD Vance, and perhaps Charlie Kirk was something like that too. So that would be worth looking into.
Yeah, maybe he was the sacrifice that was necessary to make the transition. And here's the transition that I'm making to the next segment. See that?
What did you sacrifice to make that transition?
Well, the conversation that we were having and having to kind of interrupt it and curtail it to move on to the next part. which is about, well, Peter Thiel, I guess, and more in more theoretical terms, Greg Girard. Greg Girard, that's a photographer. Jesus. I've forgotten his first name, the theorist, the French theorist. René Girard, yeah. Greg Girard's an excellent and one of my favorite photographers, but that's a completely different thing. Anyway, there's a widely discussed piece on Peter Thiel in Wired this month by Laura Bullard, which I read with a lot of interest. It's called The Real Stakes and Real Story of Peter Thiel's Antichrist Obsession. And I think it's worth kind of maybe reflect on some of the themes of this piece, particularly with Geoff here, because Greg has written quite a bit about Girard and Girardianism.
Geoff.
What did I say?
You said
Greg? No, I became Greg.
Oh.
I'm just Greg's on the brain.
Well, you can't make an omelet without breaking some Gregs.
No, very true.
Yeah. So, my apologies, Geoff. So
also, sorry, just to interrupt, but if it, Americans call like Greg. I can't really do the accent.
Craig, you mean?
It's like Craig and Greg sound the same.
I don't know.
Greg. Anyway.
Yeah, this is excellent content here.
If your name's Greg and you're a listener, tell us
how to pronounce it. Yeah.
How are you experiencing being a Greg? Do you like it? Would you recommend it?
This is why we don't record on a Friday afternoon or evening usually. Anyway, back to the point. Just to basically, I think, summarize what is the essential question about Peter Thiel in this is that there's a tension between his Girardianism, which is, I guess, can be summarized as a Catholic attempt to avoid scapegoating. And that's what kind of Christ teaches. Geoff's going to give a much more detailed and useful account of Girard than I am here. Anyway, that exists in tension for Thiel, or his commitment to Girardianism, and on the other hand, his desire to scapegoat, to exclude, to dominate, all these nasty right-wing things. That's at least kind of a very reduced account of what comes through in a long and very interesting piece in Wired, which we've linked in the show notes. But I'm going to ask Geoff to comment and perhaps maybe to firstly give us a brief account of Girard's thought to kind of set us up.
Sure. So I read this a few weeks ago. I believe it's one of these pieces that's at least pegged to his lectures on the Antichrist. Is that right? It's
yes, yeah.
The main kind of framing is around these lectures he's been giving on the Antichrist, which are exclusive. I can't remember how much a ticket costs, but they're essentially kind of gatherings of San Francisco tech elites. I will say I considered going because I tend to follow what Thiel is up to, but I've been to two other events at which he gave earlier versions of this lecture, or at least it was a single lecture, but it was definitely an earlier articulation of the same ideas he's developing there. So I feel that I have a basic sense of what he's arguing in these secret lectures, even if I did not attend them. So Thiel has been associated with Girard, who died about 10 years ago, since he was an undergraduate at Stanford, where Girard taught at the time in the 80s. And during the 90s, he frequented a seminar, a sort of non-academic, I think, off-campus seminar that Girard convened for, some of the people there were students, but others were just people in the community. And then after that, he made a lot of money from PayPal and then Facebook and other things. And he has a foundation by which he funds a lot of research kind of under the rubric of Girard's theories. So Girard is obviously relevant to the things we've just been talking about. And this is what first struck me really back in the era I was describing that Ronson wrote that book about, which is that Girard, starting in his book Violence and the Sacred, published in 1972, is interested in mob dynamics, scapegoating, and how they function as a kind of social pacification mechanism. That you have a community or a society that's riven with conflict, and one of the fundamental dynamics that tends to overtake communities or societies in which that's occurring, in which people are kind of fractured, in which there's a felt risk of a kind of Hobbesian breakdown into war of all against all is that there's a tendency to polarize against single victims or small minorities and, in a sense, discharge the community's ill feelings, its internally directed violence outwards towards those who are identified as members of these outgroups or towards individuals. And so it seems obvious that, he's describing this based on ethnography, based on ancient literature, but obviously it has a resonance for understanding what was happening in the internet in those early years. I mean, it was, I think, I would say, a striking confirmation of certain basic kind of insights of his that became such a commonly observed feature of these spaces. So it's obviously notable that Thiel was somebody who was conversant with these ideas and also was somebody who was kind of involved in creating these spaces or in building them. And I don't know, I don't want to, there are lots of speculative ways you can go. He hasn't spoken kind of directly to that, but he has said that he understood social media, a realization of a basic Girardian idea, which is related to the one I just said, which is that people are deeply imitative in terms of what they desire. And that this is the kind of primordial source of conflict, that people often become or fall into conflict with each other, not because, often not because there is a genuine, and by the way, Thiel is a libertarian, right? So this is, I think, also a point of conflict with Girardianism, because the libertarians are very interested in violence and the dangers of violence and how to control or in some way, pacify those kind of potentialities. But, for libertarians, it's really about scarcity. It's that there's a scarcity of material goods in the world, and therefore people are going to come into conflict because there are too few goods. So the Girardian theory is somewhat different, because Girard doesn't himself kind of take up this economic question about scarcity, although some of the people kind of working with his theories have, and I could go into that. But what he's interested in is that even non-scarce goods can become the object of rivalry.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.